Tom Halverson, thank you for being with us again for a check-in on the economy. It's been several months since we've been able to get you in our studio, but we're delighted to have you here with us today.
Look forward to it. The world is a dynamic place and a lot's been happening in recent weeks and months.
It has. Let's start with kind of where we are in the state of the economy here in the US. We'll bring up a chart that has a couple of key economic indicators. As you sit back and look at how the economy is performing right now, what's your overall assessment of how it's going?
What I would say is any objective observer of thoughtful and learned economists over the last year or two would say, I believe, that the economy has outperformed anybody's reasonable expectations of 6, 12, 18, 24 months ago. Back then, we thought we were going to have an interest rate rising cycle to deal with inflation, and that would constrict growth, throw us into a recession, which most people thought would have happened already, and that we would have to sustain that for a period long enough to drive the unemployment rate up to somewhere in the 6% zip code, right? So not only do we not have a shrinking economy, we've had a rapidly growing economy. We have an unemployment rate that is still very close to the lowest levels we've had in 50 years, which is extraordinary. No recession. And we've made some meaningful progress on bringing inflation down from its peak of about 9%. But as expected, inflation is always a little bit sticky coming down, and squeezing out the last bits of inflation is always the hardest part relative to the beginning of that process. And that is what we're finding here. So my takeaway is, despite what people may feel in their own personal circumstances or their own local community, at the aggregated level of the macroeconomic indicators for the country as a whole, we've been performing very strongly. Better than pretty much all of our peers around the world, and certainly better than any of us would have reasonably expected if we'd had this conversation 6, 12, 18 months ago.
Looking in detail at some of these charts, specifically the growth chart, growth was just very strong in the back half of last year. We've decelerated a little bit, but I think the consensus is 2.5% growth in 24. What are some of the key drivers of that from your perspective? What do we attribute this to?
There's a variety of factors that we can explain as uniquely attributable to the attributes of the United States, right? The energy transition, the fact that we're a net energy exporter, the reshoring of industries, investment in fundamental and basic industries, some of which we at CoBank support. There's also a big tailwind of fiscal expansion that started during COVID and is continuing because it takes a long time to push tens of billions of dollars out the door into investment projects and the like. And that process of fiscal expansion continues, right? And helps to generate the robust economic growth that we've had, which is as I said, nobody would have thought we'd still be growing at all, let alone at this rate at this time.
And then AI has been sort of the new accelerator that's come in that everyone is talking about as well.
It is certainly an accelerator, mostly at this point in terms of stock market valuations for anybody who can claim to have AI in their business model. It would be premature, I think, to say that it's fundamentally an economic outcome in GDP in terms of productivity growth and so forth. But what you've seen in the stock market is gains in anticipation and belief that those productivity growth drivers will be there long into the future because of the transformational nature of artificial intelligence.
Going back to the dashboard here, if you look at the two charts on the left side, that's kind of the good news part of this, the growth and the strong employment. But talk about the chart on the right a little more. Inflation, you said earlier, it's stickier as the lower it gets. But how much further do we need to get this thing down, and how long do you think that's going to take?
Well, there's no objective right or wrong answer to where you need to get it down to and how long that should take. But like many things in public policy land, once you've made public commitments to something, that's what you have to execute against because your credibility is your most valuable asset. And in the case of the Federal Reserve Board of the United States, they have an inflation target of 2%. Could have been 3%, could have been any other number than 2%, but it's 2%. And that's the number that they've had for a long time. And in order to sustain and enhance and protect their credibility, they got to get us there. And they continue to say that they're absolutely committed to do so, which is why, given the way the inflation prints continue to evolve, we have changed from 3 or 4 months ago when everyone thought we were going to get 3, 4, 5 interest rate reductions in 2024. We're now thinking maybe we won't get any, or maybe we'll only get one, or God forbid, we might even have another interest rate increase, which I think is probably pretty unlikely. But the trajectory of rates is different than people thought even a short period of time ago.
That's a great transition to our next slide. We'll bring that up. This shows the federal funds rate since the beginning of last year through to now. We've got a Federal Reserve meeting next week. I think most people think there probably won't be any reduction at that meeting, but talk about just the trajectory of interest rates and tie it to things that people really care about and where it really matters in the economy, and what can we expect going forward?
Well, everyone's a borrower, including the federal government of the United States, which is the biggest borrower in the entire world, and their interest rates matter a lot. This graph shows you that we had a very aggressive rate rising cycle on a curve-shaped basis, and we're stuck at this level, which we're very unlikely to go up further from, unless inflation performs in some completely unexpected manner. Because inflation hasn't gone down all the way and has ticked up in a couple of prints lately, it is the case that interest rates are staying at these levels for an extended period of time, because there's always a big time lag as interest rates flow through the economy. And we're seeing the consequences of that in different sectors, right? The amount of credit card debt, right, and the servicing costs of that credit card debt for consumers is at record levels. The debt service cost for the federal government of the United States has surpassed $1 trillion. It's not a very aggressive upward spike because of the size of the outstanding debt stock of the federal government. So this is becoming more and more expensive for people to service whatever level of debt that they have. And businesses and consumers need to adjust their expectations to the fact that rates are going to be higher for longer, and they need to accommodate their investing and spending decisions to that reality.
Are you surprised, though, at how well, given the shape of this chart, how well the economy overall has taken higher rates in stride so far?
I am, and I'm not a macroeconomist with enough econometric skill to be able to parse out or disaggregate how much of that outperformance versus expectations is attributable to the aggressive fiscal expansion cycle that we're still on, but it's clearly part of it, right? But I think most people, based on life experience of the last several decades, would have expected that rate rising cycle to put us into a recession pretty quickly and to have made unemployment be way higher much more quickly than it has turned out to be.
So we're going to bring up our last chart and pivot to our final related topic, which you referenced a second ago, which is something you've been talking about a lot at our customer meetings, and that is the federal deficit and the overall level of public debt that we have here in the United States and the problem that poses long term. Higher rates for longer, as you just said, make debt service more expensive. Just talk about why this issue matters and why you have personally been quite worried about it.
Well, it matters a lot because, the debt of the federal government has to be serviced just like the debt of you and me and our families have to be serviced. And the amount of debt that we have outstanding is at extraordinary levels, up at the levels that we've only seen at the end of World War II, for example. And it's on a trajectory, by all estimates of the Congressional Budget Office, of going up dramatically from here, given the budget fiscal position that we're in. Now, that was okay and sustainable a little bit over recent years when interest rates were effectively zero or close to zero. But now with interest rates at these levels, and with inflation in the 2.5-3% zip code, but rates higher than that, real interest rates are strongly positive for the first time in years, and so the absolute cost of servicing this is going up dramatically. And given the fact that our deficit is enormous, and that we're adding more debt to our debt stock at an accelerating rate, and that's becoming much, much more expensive because of interest rates, we are demonstrably on what anyone in a position of knowledge or authority would admit to be an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. That, the definition of unsustainable means it won't be sustained, right? So the question is, how are we going to get back on a sustainable fiscal trajectory? I worry about that a lot because it will have an enormous impact on the health and well-being of the country, even our national security. And I'm more worried about it than I would otherwise be, because we're in an election year for the United States House, the United States Senate, a big chunk of the Senate, and for the President of the United States. And neither party is talking about this at all. And therefore, there doesn't seem to be any pressure for interest in adjudicating or addressing this issue in any responsible manner this side of the inauguration of the next president of the United States. So we are careening into risky and dangerous territory at an accelerating rate with no apparent adult foot on the brakes to be found. And that is not a position that we can stay in for very long.
I'm curious, when you talked about this out at our customer meetings and interacted with our customers about it, how much energy and interest did you hear? This is a topic where there is often, deficits have been around for a long time. There has been a fair amount of apathy, I would say, in the public domain about this specific problem. But did you hear and get a lot of agreement about this from the people who heard your speech?
Well, I spoke about it at 9 customer meetings across the United States to several thousand customers. And while it is particularly nerdy and unsexy material and information, I think the vast majority of people can understand when it's explained to them what the issue is, why it matters, and I had a lot of really, really positive feedback from customers. Many of our customers wanted copies of my speech and my charts and graphs so that they could share them, in their local community or in the business that they run or what have you. And a lot of people said in a competition of highly nerdy material that it was the best speech that they've seen me give on any economic topic in recent years. So I think there's actually an appetite in the country for us to be responsible, and an appreciation of what that means, even though the implications are unpopular and painful in terms of what kinds of steps we would need to take on a sustained basis to put ourselves on a trajectory that's responsible for the health and well-being of the country, not just today, but for future generations.